I was deaf for years until a surgery gave me my hearing back. I kept it secret to surprise my daughter. Instead, I heard her planning to steal all my money and get rid of me. So I decided to give her a surprise they'd never forget. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. My name is Harriet Bishop. For 40 years I was a court stenographer. My world was one of silent observation, a place where I transcribed the loud, messy, and often tragic stories of other people's lives. As my own hearing faded, leaving me in a world of profound silence, I became a master of what was left unseen and unsaid. I could read the subtle tick in a lawyer's jaw, the flicker of fear in a witness's eyes, the unspoken truth that hung in the air long after the words had faded from the lips of those who could still speak them. My life was a study in silence. Now, after a miracle of modern medicine, my world is once again full of sound. And for the past 2 weeks I've kept this miracle a secret. I was waiting for the perfect moment to surprise my daughter, Gabrielle, to see the look of joy on her face when she realized we could finally speak to each other again, heart to heart. But the surprise, it turned out, was for me, because in the quiet of my own home, I finally heard my daughter's true voice, and what she had to say was a verdict, a condemnation, and a declaration of war. The new world of sound was a symphony of the mundane, and it was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. For the first week after my cochlear implant was activated, I did nothing but sit in my own home and listen. For 10 years my world had been a silent film. A degenerative condition had stolen my hearing slowly, piece by piece, until all that was left was a muffled, distant roar, like the sound of the ocean heard from miles away. I had adapted. I had learned to read lips with a stenographer's precision. I had filled my home with flashing lights that told me when the phone was ringing, or when someone was at the door. I had learned to live in a world without sound. But I had never, not for a moment, stopped missing it. The surgery was my last desperate hope. A new experimental procedure that my audiologist, the brilliant and kind Dr. Evelyn Reed, had suggested. The recovery had been long and difficult, but the moment she had activated the implant, the moment the first distorted and then miraculously clear sounds had flooded my brain, had been a rebirth. I had wept in her office, not with sadness, but with a joy so profound it was a physical ache in my chest. I had decided, in that moment, to keep my miracle a secret. Just for a little while. I wanted to surprise my daughter Gabrielle. I imagined the scene with a cinematic clarity. She would come for her weekly visit, and she would start to sign to me, her hands moving in the familiar, graceful patterns of our silent conversations. And I would simply speak. I would say her name, Gabrielle. And I would watch as the confusion on her face melted into a dawning, tearful, and beautiful understanding. It would be a moment of pure cinematic joy. A reunion not just of a mother and a daughter, but of two worlds. The world of sound and the world of silence. Finally beautifully bridged. So I waited. For 2 weeks I lived with my secret, a joyful buzzing thing in the center of my chest. I practiced hearing, relearning the subtle nuances of a world I had forgotten, and I waited for Gabrielle. She arrived for her weekly visit, not alone but with her husband, Terence. This was not unusual. He often came with her, his presence a silent, supportive backdrop to her performance of the dutiful daughter. Gabrielle was a pharmacist, a respected professional, and in our small community she was a saint, the devoted daughter who had so lovingly, so patiently cared for her deaf mother. She performed the role beautifully. She would use sign language with me in public, even when she knew I was reading her lips, a small public display of her dedication. She spoke with an exaggerated, slow precision, her voice a little too loud, a gesture that other people saw as thoughtful but that I had always found deeply, quietly patronizing. Today she was in full performance mode. She swept into my living room, a bright, cheerful whirlwind of filial devotion. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice booming, her hands already forming the signs for hello. She gave me a perfunctory kiss on the cheek, her expensive perfume a chemical cloud in the quiet air of my home. Terence followed behind her, a slick, handsome man with a charming smile and the cold, empty eyes of a shark. He gave me a polite, meaningless nod. "Harriet," he said, his own voice a little too loud. I smiled. A genuine, bubbling, and deeply joyful smile. The surprise was on the tip of my tongue. I was about to open my mouth to speak, to say her name, to give her the gift of my voice. But before I could, Terence turned to his wife, his back to me, believing, as they always did, that they were in a cone of silence. that I was a deaf, smiling, and utterly oblivious piece of furniture in the room. So, he said, his voice now a low, conspiratorial murmur, a voice I had never heard before, but one that my new miraculous ears picked up with a terrifying crystal clarity. About the timeline for your mother's future. The surprise I had planned, the joyful, tearful reunion died in that instant. A new and far more terrible surprise was about to be revealed, and I, the silent observer, the court stenographer, was about to hear a testimony that would change my world forever. I froze. The joyful, bubbling words of my surprise turned to ash in my mouth. My smile, which had been so genuine just a moment before, became a mask, a fragile, brittle thing I held in place with all my strength. Terrence's words, spoken in a low, conspiratorial murmur I had never been intended to hear, were a key unlocking a door to a room I had never known existed. A dark, hidden chamber in the heart of my own family. About the timeline for your mother's future. As they stood in my living room, their backs to me, believing themselves to be in a private, soundproof bubble of my deafness, the court stenographer in me took over. My brain, trained by 40 years of silent, intense observation, began to record. Gabrielle's voice was a low, impatient hiss. I know, Terrence. I know, but we have to be careful. Dr. Reed said the recovery from the surgery was going well. We can't rush it. It has to look natural. Surgery. They knew about the surgery, but they did not know it had been a success. They were operating on a different set of facts, a different and a far more convenient narrative. As I sat there, a silent, smiling statue on my own sofa, my mind raced. The pieces of a puzzle I had not even known existed suddenly, sickeningly snapping into place. The history of my daughter's perfect care, the narrative she had so carefully crafted for the world, was a lie. Her dutiful visits, her performative sign language, her exaggerated patient speech. It was not an act of love. It was a long con. It was the careful, methodical grooming of a mark. My mind flashed back through the years. I saw myself a single mother after my husband's early death, working 2 jobs, my hands aching from the relentless, punishing rhythm of the stenotype machine. I saw myself meticulously, obsessively saving every spare penny, building a nest egg, a fortress of financial security, not for myself but for her. For Gabrielle. I had put her through pharmacy school without her having to take on a single dollar of debt. I had given her the down payment for her first home. My life savings, a significant 7-figure sum I had built through a lifetime of sacrifice and shrewd investing, was always in my mind for her. It was her future, her legacy. And I had, it seemed, been a fool. Terrence's voice, a smooth, confident purr of pure, uncut greed, pulled me back to the present. I've spoken to my lawyer, he said. He's been consulting with a neurologist. The precedent is clear. A sudden, significant hearing loss in the elderly is often linked to a corresponding cognitive decline, auditory-related dementia. It's a real thing. We just need to start building the case. Cognitive decline. The words were a cold, sharp, clinical stab in the heart. They were not just planning to steal my money. They were planning to steal my mind. So what's the play? Gabrielle asked, her voice a low, practical whisper. I could hear the rustle of her coat as she moved closer to him. The play is simple, Terrence said, his voice dropping even lower, but my new superhuman ears missing not a single damning syllable. We start documenting. We note her confusion, her memory lapses, her inability to manage her own affairs. We get her a new doctor, someone who will give us the diagnosis we need. Once we have that, we petition the court for a conservatorship. We get you appointed as her legal guardian, with full power of attorney over her assets. Power of attorney? The legal instrument of their coup? And then, Gabrielle's voice was a breath, a whisper of pure, avaricious desire. And then, Terrence said, his voice a low, triumphant growl. We are finally free. We sell this house. We liquidate her portfolio. We use the money to get my new development project off the ground. And your mother will be moved to a facility that is more appropriate for her condition. A nice, quiet, state-run place where she can be properly cared for, and where she will no longer be a burden to us. A state-run place, the final, brutal, and unforgivable destination. They were planning to have me declared incompetent, to steal my life savings and to dump me in a nursing home to rot. And then, my daughter, my only child, the person I loved more than life itself, spoke the words that shattered the last remaining vestiges of my heart. Okay, she said, her voice a quiet, firm, and utterly chilling sound of agreement. Let's do it. It's the only way we'll ever be free. Free. Free of me. The mother who had given her everything, the woman whose only crime was to have grown old and deaf. I sat on my sofa, my face a smiling pleasant and utterly fraudulent mask, and I listened, as my daughter and my son-in-law in the quiet sunlit sanctuary of my own living room, calmly, methodically, and with a terrifying, dispassionate clarity plotted my destruction. The surprise was over. The testimony had been heard. The court of my own heart had just delivered its verdict. They were guilty. And I, the silent, smiling, and now secretly, miraculously hearing court stenographer, would be the one to deliver the sentence. I did not move. I did not speak. I did not give them the satisfaction of a single, betraying flicker of the rage and the grief that was a roaring white-hot inferno in my chest. My 40 years in the courtroom had taught me the profound strategic power of the poker face. An emotional reaction is a loss of control. It is a confession of weakness, and I could not be weak. Not now. So, I performed. I gave the performance of a lifetime. I became the woman they believed me to be, the sweet, slightly dotty and utterly oblivious deaf mother. I smiled my pleasant vacant smile. I watched their lips pretending to read them, even though their clear damning words were now ringing in my ears. When Gabrielle turned back to me, her own face a mask of false filial concern, I was ready. "We were just talking about dinner next week, Mom," she said, her voice once again the loud, slow, patronizing boom she reserved for me. Her hands moved in a clumsy, exaggerated imitation of the sign for eat. "We want to take you somewhere special." A last supper, I thought. A cold, bitter humor rising in my throat. I nodded my enthusiastic, foolish old woman nod. I made the sign for yes, my own hands moving with their usual practiced grace. "Yes, my dear daughter," I thought. "Let's have dinner. Let's play this little game of yours. But you have no idea that the rules have just changed. The board has been flipped, and I am no longer a pawn in your game. I am the queen." They stayed for another hour, an agonizing eternity of a visit. They sat on my sofa, they drank my tea, and they continued their grotesque performance of the loving, dutiful family. They spoke to me of trivial things, their voices loud and slow, their hands moving in a pantomime of communication, and all the while, I listened. I listened to the quiet, almost imperceptible hiss of contempt in Gabrielle's voice when she thought I wasn't looking. I sat in my living room for a long time, the sounds of my own home, the ticking clock, the humming refrigerator, no longer a source of joy but a grim, steady reminder of the world I had to protect. The grief, the profound, soul-deep wound of my daughter's betrayal was a physical thing, a heavy, cold stone in the center of my chest. I allowed myself to feel it, for a moment. I allowed a few hot, silent tears to trace a path down my cheeks. And then, I stopped. I wiped my eyes. The time for grief was over. The time for action had begun. My daughter and her husband had made a critical and a very foolish mistake. They had underestimated their opponent. They saw a frail, deaf and helpless old woman. They did not see the court stenographer. They did not see the woman who had spent a lifetime listening to lies, to deceptions, to the carefully constructed fictions of guilty men. They did not see the woman who knew better than anyone the profound and the permanent power of a documented, irrefutable and legally binding record. They wanted to build a case against me. Well, I was about to build a case of my own, and mine would be a masterpiece. The first step in any counteroffensive is to secure your allies. I had been a solitary woman for a long time, my world having shrunk to the size of my small, silent home, but I was not entirely alone. I had one new and a very powerful ally, and she was the only person in the world who knew my secret. The next morning, I had a follow-up appointment with my audiologist and surgeon, Dr. Evelyn Reed. It was a routine checkup, a simple appointment to monitor my progress. It became a council of war. Dr. Reed was a brilliant, no-nonsense woman in her 40s, a rising star in her field. She was sharp, empathetic, and she had taken a keen personal interest in my case. She saw the success of my surgery not just as a professional triumph, but as a human one. When I had wept in her office 2 weeks ago, she had cried with me. Today, when she greeted me in her examination room, her face was a mask of professional, cheerful concern. "Harriet," she said, her voice warm and kind. "How are you feeling? How is the new world of sound treating you?" I looked at her, at this kind, intelligent and trustworthy woman, and the dam of my carefully constructed composure finally broke. I did not just weep, I sobbed. a racking, painful, and deeply cathartic torrent of the grief and the rage I had been holding in for the past 24 hours. Dr. Reed was by my side in an instant, her hand on my shoulder, her voice a low, soothing murmur. She did not rush me, she simply waited, a calm, steady presence in the storm of my own anguish. When my sobs had finally subsided into a series of ragged, shuddering breaths, I told her everything. I recounted the entire sordid and horrifying story. My plan for the surprise, their arrival, the quiet, conspiratorial murmur of their voices, the details of their plot, the manufactured diagnosis of cognitive decline, the petition for a conservatorship, the plan to steal my life savings and to dump me in a state-run facility. I told her the words my own daughter had spoken, "It's the only way we'll ever be free." As I spoke, I watched the expression on Dr. Reed's face shift from one of compassionate concern to one of cold, righteous, and deeply satisfying fury. She was not just a doctor, she was a woman, and she was a woman who understood on a visceral level the profound and the monstrous nature of the betrayal I was describing. When I was finished, a heavy, angry silence filled the room. Dr. Reed's face was a mask of stone. That is the most despicable thing I have ever heard," she said, her voice a low, dangerous growl. "This isn't just a family matter, Harriet. This is a criminal conspiracy. This is premeditated elder fraud of the highest order." She stood up and began to pace the small examination room, her movements sharp and agitated. "And to use your deafness, the very condition I have just spent months treating, as the weapon against you, it's monstrous." She stopped her pacing and looked at me, her eyes alight with a fierce protective fire. "Okay," she said, her voice now sharp and decisive, the voice of a surgeon who has just identified a cancer that needs to be cut out. "Here is what we are going to do. First, you are going to get a lawyer, not just any lawyer. The hospital retains one of the top estate litigation firms in the state. I will make a call. You will have an appointment by tomorrow. Second," she continued, her mind clearly already working on the strategic details of the counteroffensive, "we need evidence, undeniable, irrefutable evidence. Your testimony is powerful, but in a court of law it can be dismissed as the confused ramblings of an elderly woman, which is exactly the narrative they are trying to build." She walked over to a locked cabinet in her office and opened it. She rummaged inside for a moment, and then pulled out a small black and deceptively simple-looking device. It was no bigger than a matchbox. "This," she said, placing it in the palm of my hand, "is a high-fidelity digital audio recorder. It's one of the models we use for research to record patient interviews. The audio quality is superb. It can pick up a whisper from across a room, and its battery life is over 24 hours. That's all." She looked at me, a small, cold, and deeply satisfying smile on her lips. "I think," she said, "that it's time you invited your daughter and your son-in-law over for a nice, long, and very honest family dinner." The plan that Dr. Reed and I formulated in her quiet, sterile office was a masterpiece of strategic and a deeply satisfying entrapment. The key was to create a situation where Gabrielle and Terence felt so confident, so superior, so utterly in control, that they would willingly and even eagerly walk into the trap themselves. The bait was my own, feigned vulnerability. I had to become the woman they already believed me to be, confused, forgetful, and increasingly incapable of managing my own life. I had to not just play the part of the deaf, dotty old mother. I had to lean into it to give them the evidence they were so desperately trying to manufacture. I went home from Dr. Reed's office with the small, powerful audio recorder in my handbag, and a new and a very clear sense of purpose. I was no longer just a victim, I was a hunter, and I was about to set the most beautiful and the most meticulously crafted trap of my life. I spent the next 2 days preparing for the performance. I practiced my role. I would be a little more forgetful, I would seem a little more confused. I would ask the same question twice. Small, subtle things that would build their confidence, that would make them believe their own vile narrative about my cognitive decline. Then, I made the call. I used a text relay service, a system for the deaf that transcribes a spoken conversation, a method that would reinforce my performance of helplessness. I invited them for dinner on Saturday night. "I've been doing some thinking about the future," I typed, the words appearing on their end in a synthesized, electronic voice. "And you are right. It is all very confusing for me. I would like to talk to you both about my will, and about making things easier for you in the long run." The bait was taken immediately. They accepted the invitation with an alacrity that was almost comical. They were sure this was the result of their own clever psychological pressure. The old woman was finally cracking. She was ready to surrender. The evening of the dinner I was a bundle of nerves, not of fear but of a kind of high-stakes theatrical excitement. My house was the stage. I was the lead actress, and my audience of two was about to witness the performance of a lifetime. I prepared a simple, elegant meal, a roasted chicken with rosemary and lemon, their favorite, and then I set the trap. The digital recorder was a tiny black rectangle, almost invisible. I used a small piece of double-sided tape to affix it to the back of a heavy silver picture frame that sat on the mantelpiece in the dining room. The frame held a photograph of my late husband Samuel. He would be my silent, watchful witness to the proceedings. From its position on the mantelpiece, the recorder's tiny, powerful microphone had a clear, unobstructed line to the dining table. It was perfect. They arrived at 7 p.m. sharp, their faces masks of solicitous and utterly fraudulent concern. Gabrielle had brought a bouquet of funereal-looking lilies, which I graciously accepted before discreetly moving them to a room where their cloying scent wouldn't overwhelm me. Terence was carrying a bottle of expensive oaky Chardonnay which he presented with a flourish, as if it were a tribute to a conquering hero. We sat down to dinner, and I began my performance. They exchanged a small, triumphant and almost imperceptible glance. It was working. They were completely and arrogantly buying it. They were so lost in their own sense of superiority, so convinced of my decline, that they had no idea they were not the puppeteers in this little drama. They were the puppets. The trap had been set. The bait had been taken. The recording was live. Now all I had to do was to get them to confess, and I knew exactly how to do it. The main course was cleared away. I served the dessert, a simple apple crumble, a recipe of my mother's, and then as they were sipping their coffee, I leaned forward, my expression a mask of worried and a deeply sincere-looking confusion. I had a notepad and a pen beside my plate, a prop I had been using all evening to help me keep track of the conversation. I pushed it towards them. On it I had written a single simple question. My savings, are they safe? It was a beautiful, multi-layered piece of bait. It played directly into their narrative of my cognitive decline, and it opened the door for them to reassure me, to explain in their own damning words their plan. Terence took the bait with the greedy, lunging enthusiasm of a starving shark. He put on his best, most patient and most deeply condescending "let me explain this to you in simple terms" voice. "Of course they are safe, Harriet," he said, his voice loud and slow as if speaking to a particularly dim-witted child. "But you are right to be concerned. An asset portfolio of your size requires active management, and as we've discussed, it's becoming a little much for you to handle on your own." Gabrielle chimed in, her voice a symphony of false, cloying sympathy. "That's what we are here for, Mom. To take that burden off your shoulders. To make sure you are protected." I picked up my pen, my hand shaking with a carefully manufactured tremor. I wrote another question on the notepad. "But the bank? They said I am fine?" Terence let out a small, paternal, and deeply insulting chuckle. "Harriet," he said, his voice dripping with condescending pity, "the people at the bank are not doctors. They don't understand the complexities of the situation. Your hearing loss, it's connected to other things, to your memory, to your ability to make sound financial decisions. We've been talking to some experts and they all agree. It's a classic case of auditory-related cognitive decline." Auditory-related cognitive decline. He had said the magic words. The first part of the confession was now officially and beautifully on the record. I looked at him, my eyes wide with a feigned helpless confusion. I wrote another note. "So, what do we do?" "It's very simple," Terence said, leaning forward, his eyes gleaming with a triumphant, predatory light. He was so close to the prize, he could taste it. "We have our lawyer, a wonderful man who specializes in elder care, draw up some simple paperwork. It's called a conservatorship. It just gives Gabrielle the legal authority to manage your finances on your behalf, to pay your bills, to manage your investments, to make sure your money is working for you, not against you. It's a safety net, Harriet. It's for your own protection." "And the house?" I wrote, my pen scratching on the paper. "The house is a wonderful asset," Terence said smoothly. "But it's a lot for you to maintain. The upkeep, the taxes, it's a burden. The smart move, the one that makes the most financial sense, is to liquidate that asset. We sell it, and we invest the proceeds in a fund that will generate a steady, reliable income for your future care." "My future care," I wrote. Gabrielle reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. Her skin was cold. "Yes, Mom," she said, her voice a soft, venomous purr. "We've found a wonderful facility for you. A place where you can be safe and where you will have round-the-clock care. It will be so much better for you. You won't have to worry about a thing." They had just, in their own, confident, condescending and beautifully articulate voices, confessed to their entire monstrous plot. They had admitted to their plan to have me declared incompetent. They had admitted to their plan to seize my assets. They had admitted to their plan to sell my house and to put me in a home. It was all there. A perfect, crystal clear and legally damning confession. All of it captured by the small, silent and wonderfully efficient little recorder that was sitting on the mantelpiece. A silent, impartial witness to their own spectacular self-immolation. The confession was secured. The evidence was on the record. The week that followed was a quiet and a deeply satisfying period of legal mobilization. The day after the dinner, I retrieved the recorder from its hiding place. I sat in my study, a pair of high-quality headphones on, and I listened to the recording. To hear their voices, so calm, so confident, so utterly devoid of any love or compassion, as they plotted my destruction, was a painful but a necessary final confirmation. The last, lingering vestiges of any maternal sentiment, any hope for their redemption, withered and died. They were not my children. They were a threat. A hostile entity that had to be neutralized. My first meeting was with Dr. Reed. I played the recording for her. She listened, her face a mask of stone, her eyes blazing with a cold, righteous fury. When it was over, she simply said, "Good, now we have them, and we are going to bury them." My second meeting was with the lawyer. He was a man named Benjamin Carter, a senior partner at the top estate litigation firm in the state. A man whose formidable reputation was matched only by his exorbitant hourly rate. He was a recommendation from the hospital's legal department, a legal battleship that Dr. Reed had called in on my behalf. He was a tall, imposing man in his late 50s, with a quiet, watchful demeanor and the eyes of a chess grandmaster who sees the entire board, 10 moves ahead. Dr. Reed and I sat in his vast book-lined corner office. I did not speak of my hurt, of my betrayal. I simply, and with a court stenographer's dispassionate clarity, laid out the facts of the case. And then I played him the recording. He listened to the entire 20-minute confession without a single betraying flicker of emotion on his face. When it was over, he simply steepled his long, elegant fingers and looked at me. A small, cold, and deeply appreciative smile touched his lips. "Mrs. Bishop," he said, his voice a low, impressed rumble. "In my 30 years of practicing law, I have seen a great many foolish criminals, but I have rarely if ever seen a pair of fools so willingly and so beautifully hang themselves with their own articulate rope. This is not a case. This is a work of art." He then went to work. For the next week, his office became the war room for my counteroffensive. He was a master of his craft, a legal artist of the highest order. He did not just plan a defense, he planned an annihilation. The first step was to protect my assets. He drafted an ironclad, irrevocable trust. It was a beautiful, complex, and utterly ruthless piece of legal engineering. It took my entire multi-million-dollar estate, my house, my savings, my investment portfolio, and it locked it away in a legal fortress so impregnable that not even the most creative, most determined legal assault could breach it. And the sole and permanent beneficiary of that trust, it was not my daughter, it was a national charity. A wonderful organization that provided cochlear implants and auditory therapy to low-income seniors. The very technology that had saved me would now be my legacy. The second step was to rewrite my will. It was a simple, brutal, and deeply satisfying document. It explicitly, and with a wealth of legal justification that cited the evidence on the recording, disinherited my only child, Gabrielle Bishop Thompson, completely and permanently. The final step was to prepare for the final, glorious, and deeply satisfying confrontation. The stage had been set. The legal trap was in place. All that was left was to summon the 2 lead actors for their final tragic performance. The invitation was delivered, once again via the text relay service, a final, perfect flourish of my performance of deafness. I sent a message to Gabrielle and Terence, my tone a mixture of feigned confusion and eager anticipation. "My lawyer has drawn up the papers we discussed," I typed, "the power of attorney, and the other things. He says it is a very good plan. He would like to meet with all of us, to have us sign everything together. He says it is a very exciting day. They responded almost immediately, their own texts a mixture of condescending reassurance and barely concealed, triumphant glee. "That's wonderful, Mom. We are so proud of you for making this smart decision." They were certain this was it, the culmination of their brilliant plan, the day they would finally legally get their hands on my money. They agreed to meet at my lawyer's office the following afternoon at 2 p.m. They had no idea that they were not walking into a signing, they were walking into a sentencing. The conference room at Benjamin Carter's law firm was a world of quiet, intimidating power. The walls were paneled in a dark, rich mahogany. The table was a vast, polished slab of granite that was 20 feet long, and the view from the floor-to-ceiling windows was a panoramic commanding vista of the entire city. I was there, with Dr. Reed at my side, a silent, supportive, and deeply satisfying presence. We were seated on one side of the massive table. My lawyer, Benjamin Carter, sat at the head, a quiet, formidable judge in his own personal courtroom. Gabrielle and Terence arrived at 2 p.m. sharp. They were dressed for victory. Terence was in a crisp, expensive-looking business suit, a confident, predatory smile on his face. "Mom," Gabrielle said, her voice the loud, slow boom she reserved for me. "We're here. We are so happy you decided to do this. It's for the best." I simply smiled my sweet, deaf and foolish old mother's smile, and gestured to the two empty chairs opposite me. They sat down, their eyes scanning the room, a faint, almost imperceptible flicker of confusion on their faces. They had expected a simple meeting, a quick signing. They had not expected the presence of Dr. Reed. They had not expected the heavy, formal, and deeply unsettling atmosphere of the room. Benjamin Carter let the silence stretch for a long, uncomfortable moment, allowing their confidence to slowly, beautifully begin to curdle into a low-grade anxiety. Finally, he spoke. His voice was calm, quiet, and utterly devoid of any warmth. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," he began, "thank you for coming. My client, Mrs. Harriet Bishop, has indeed asked me to convene this meeting to discuss her future planning. But before we get to the documents, there is another piece of business we need to attend to. There is a recording that my client would like for you to hear." He did not wait for their response. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small, sleek, and very powerful-looking portable speaker. He placed it in the center of the vast granite table. He then took out his phone, tapped the screen a few times, and pressed play. And from the small black speaker, a voice filled the silent, cavernous room. It was Terence's voice, a smooth, confident, and utterly damning sound. "It's a classic case of auditory-related cognitive decline." The effect was instantaneous. The color drained from Terence's face. Gabrielle's serene, confident smile froze, then shattered. They stared at the small black speaker as if it were a venomous snake that had just materialized in the center of the table. They were forced to sit there in the dead, heavy silence of that beautiful, intimidating room, and listen to a crystal-clear, high-fidelity recording of their own voices. They heard themselves plotting to have me declared incompetent. They heard themselves planning to steal my money. They heard themselves discussing the best way to get rid of me, to dump me in a state-run facility. They heard my daughter, my only child, agreeing that it was the only way they could ever be free. It was the longest, and I am certain the most excruciating 20 minutes of their lives. And I watched them, my face a mask of calm, neutral, and deeply satisfying observation. When the recording finally ended, a profound and a deeply, deeply satisfying silence filled the room. Gabrielle and Terence were ashen-faced, their expressions a mixture of pure, unadulterated terror and a dawning, horrified understanding of the catastrophic, life-altering mistake they had just made. Benjamin Carter let the silence hang in the air for another long, punishing moment, and then he continued, his voice the calm, dispassionate sound of a judge delivering a final and a non-negotiable verdict. He slid two thick, legally bound documents across the polished granite table towards them. "As a result of the information that has just been presented," he said, his voice a masterpiece of quiet, legalistic understatement, "my client, Miss Bishop, has made the decision to completely restructure her estate plan." He tapped the first document. "This," he said, "is a copy of Mrs. Bishop's new and irrevocable last will and testament. I would draw your attention to Article 3, Section B, which explicitly and with a wealth of supporting evidence that includes the recording you have just heard, disinherits her daughter Mrs. Gabrielle Bishop Thompson completely and permanently. The bulk of Mrs. Bishop's considerable estate will now be bequeathed to a charitable trust dedicated to providing auditory assistance to low-income seniors." He then tapped the second document. "And this," he continued, his voice as cold and as hard as the granite table, is a legally drafted restraining order, which will be filed with the court this afternoon. It prohibits both of you from coming within 500 feet of Mrs. Bishop, her home, or her place of business, and from attempting to contact her in any way, shape, or form, for the rest of her natural life. He let the weight of his words settle into the silent, horrified room, and then, he delivered the final fatal blow. I should also inform you, he concluded, his eyes locked on Terrence's now sweating, terrified face, that a copy of the recording you have just heard, along with a formal and a very detailed complaint, has been forwarded to the district attorney's office for review. The preliminary charge will be conspiracy to commit felony elder fraud. I believe a detective from that office will be contacting you very, very soon. The trap had not just been sprung, it had been a legal, financial, and a deeply, deeply personal annihilation. The room was a vacuum, all the air sucked out by the force of their own implosion. Terrence, the slick real estate developer, the master of the deal, looked like a man who had just been told he had 5 minutes to live. He was a pale, sweating, and utterly broken thing. But Gabrielle, my daughter, made one last desperate and beautifully foolish attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. She turned to me, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a stunning, uncomprehending disbelief. The carefully constructed world of her own lies was a prison she could not even now escape. She began to sign to me, her hands moving in a clumsy, frantic, and pathetic pantomime of our old silent conversations. The signs for mother, for mistake, for sorry. And then she spoke, her voice a strangled, desperate whisper. But you couldn't have, she stammered, her brain finally belatedly grasping the central, impossible fact of her own downfall. You couldn't have hurt us. You can't hear. I did not sign. I did not write a note. I did not use the professional, dispassionate voice of my lawyer. I used my own. I leaned forward, and for the first time in her adult life, my daughter heard my true, clear, and unadulterated voice. It was not the loud, booming, and patronizing tone she had used with me. It was the quiet, precise, and perfectly modulated voice of a court stenographer. A voice that had been trained for 40 years to deliver the truth with an absolute and an unassailable clarity. Oh, but I did, Gabrielle, I said. My voice as calm, as steady, and as final as a judge's gavel. I heard every single word. The finality of my voice, the simple, undeniable truth of it, was the blow that finally truly broke her. A sound escaped her lips, a low, wounded animal cry of pure, unadulterated despair. The performance was over. The lies were gone. All that was left was the raw, ugly, and deeply, deeply satisfying truth of her own, self-inflicted ruin. The months that followed were a quiet, and a deeply, deeply satisfying, renaissance. The restraining order was granted. The district attorney's office, armed with my perfect, crystal-clear recording, opened a criminal investigation into Terrence and Gabrielle. My own life, in stark and a beautiful contrast, began to bloom. The silence I had once lived in, a silence of biology, had been replaced by a new and a far more profound silence. A silence of choice. My home, once a tense and a deeply unhappy place, was now a sanctuary of peace. And it was no longer quiet. I filled it with the sounds I had missed for so long. The music of Ella Fitzgerald and John Coltrane, the cheerful, mindless chatter of old black and white movies. And best of all, the sound of my friends' laughter. I had come out of my self-imposed shell, and with the help of Dr. Reed, I had found a new, and a very powerful purpose. I had become a philanthropist. I was now the primary benefactor of the charitable trust I had established, the organization that was now my sole heir. I worked with them, using my own experience, and a considerable portion of my own money to help other less fortunate seniors get the same life-altering cochlear implant surgery that had saved me. My life was no longer a quiet, lonely, and shrinking thing. It was a loud, joyful, and expanding universe of purpose and connection. The final scene of my old life, and the first scene of my new one, took place on a warm, sunny afternoon in the late spring. I was sitting on my back porch, a place that had once been a source of tension and silent, lonely meals. Now it was my favorite place in the world. I was not alone. I was with a group of women, the first recipients of the Harriet Bishop Grant for auditory restoration. We were laughing, we were sharing stories, and we were most importantly listening to each other. The story ends, not with a bang, not with a final dramatic confrontation, but with a quiet and a deeply, deeply satisfying sound. The sound of the wind, rustling through the leaves of the old oak tree in my backyard. I closed my eyes, and I just listened. For years silence had been my prison. Now it was a choice. And the sounds of the world, the beautiful, simple, and miraculous sounds of a life being lived, were a gift. A gift I had, in the end, given to myself. And it was the sweetest sound I had ever heard.